Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, WCED. Welcome to our first webinar of the new semester. Very happy to have Christian Davenport here with us today. So just for basic logistics here, so audience members should submit their questions through the dedicated Q&A window. If you wouldn't mind, please provide your title and affiliation along with a question. And we encourage you to submit your questions during Professor Davenport's presentation itself. You don't need to wait until the presentation concludes to write down your questions. So before we get started, just a quick notice of what's to come. Next month, we're going to be having our former postdoc, Fiona Shenbai, who is now at William and Mary. She's going to be giving her a presentation on autocratic courts in sub-Saharan Africa. This is on February 23rd at 4 p.m. 4 p.m. is our usual time, so the noon time is a bit unusual today. Her talk will be called Undue Process, Persecution and Punishment in Autocratic Courts. And then on March 9th, we're going to be having a roundtable called Reviving Democracy Globally and Locally. And that will be with Michael McFall from Stanford University, former ambassador to Russia. I imagine he'll have comments on what's going on in Russia, or whatever will be going on in Russia as of March 9th. And also Hari Han, who is the director of the Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. So that should be great. That'll be on March 9th at 4 p.m. So, but here we are today. So without further ado, let me quickly introduce my friend and colleague, Christian Davenport. Christian is a professor of political science, as well as a faculty associate at the Center for Political Studies here at the University of Michigan. He's also a research professor at the Peace Research Institute Oslo, or PRIO. He is the author of 6 books, most recently The Peace Continuum with Oxford University Press, and How Social Movements Die with Cambridge University Press. And he's currently working on numerous other book projects, including a book called Stopping State Repression, one called In Search of a Number, Rethinking Rwanda in 1994, and Understanding Untouchability. Christian is also engaged in various projects concerning state dissident interactions in the United States, India, and Northern Ireland. So as we think in the wake of recent events here in the United States about the ways in which democracy and violence can go together in some disturbing ways, it's going to be really great to have his insights. And Professor Davenport's talk today will be entitled Starting, Stopping, and Restarting State Repression, an Analysis of Spells. So without further ado, thank you all for coming. Christian, thanks for making the time. You're a busy man. We're really lucky to have you.
Thank you, Dan. I'm very happy to be here and always interact with you. I'm going to offer somewhat of a pivot, though. I think I'm just going to do stopping with some hints at onset. But I was like looking over the piece today, and I was like, that might be too much. But we do it in the book. But I think the version that I'm going to do here is, I think it clarifies some things that I think is harder to do in the other one. So I felt a little bit less comfortable about doing that. It is in the book, so I'm not going to pull that pivot as like we see the book, y'all. I won't do that. But definitely willing to talk about the different parts involved. So I'll focus on stopping, but there's allusions to onset, and then I'll show you some of the results for the various forms, and it'll become clear from this why I've taken the approach that I have, but also why I wanted to kind of pull back a little bit to focus a little bit more. And sorry, I use Prezi. It's less volatile than it used to be, but it's still a little bit more mobile. So in many respects, I came to this topic after mulling over a great deal about state repression and thinking through the logic of what we could do about repression. And I was led to the project in many ways because of some time that I spent at the Russell Sage Foundation. I went there to do a piece post 9/11 on understanding protest policing. And as what sometimes happens, my programmer had a loss and was no longer available. So I was kind of like in New York and looking for a new topic. And then while kind of like wandering around, I came across these these posters for I Am an African, and it would be like Sarah Jessica Parker, and I'm like, what? And then like David Bowie, and I'm like, yo, okay, so I really need to find out what this campaign is about. And it was really kind of an effort to sensitize individuals to kind of like, we should care about Africa because we are Africans. And in line with that, I became more interested in like political advertising. And then Darfur Now was engaging in some activities as well. And I was like, wow, these are really ramped up. These are fantastic. And so that it occurred to me, I'm just like, violent, widespread, and systematic state behavior is a major problem. And I kind of took this pivot that I had not taken previously, which is like, what is worth doing? If I had a year, which I do now, it's like at the time, I was like, what is worth understanding? And I'm like, stopping these activities. And so then I pivoted in a direction where there's a tremendous amount of effort to understand how to prevent, terminate, and punish and reconcile people from these activities. And I felt that we hadn't really spent that much time to understanding what stops them. And there's numerous documents and numerous organizations that are focused on this particular objective. And so I think I was a very good company in making this pivot and trying to think about it. And interestingly enough, from the literature on state repression, my particular label that I run with it, but other folks go in genocide or atrocities, or sustained human rights violations or personal integrity violations. I think we're all pivoting around the same thing. But what's interesting about the literature is different people had their kind of like intervention or independent variable that they favored. Some focused on economic sanctions, some focused on democratization, some naming and shaming, and some military intervention. And I mentioned this particularity of highlighting in part because since one of these things was basically the interest of the author, the rest of them kind of got short shrift. And I mean, in the sense that they weren't necessarily attentive to differences or evolutions that had taken place in terms of proper operationalization or exploration of nonlinear relationships or other types of nuances. And so surprisingly, not really, folks end up, favoring and discovering their particular piece. So like Keck and Sickink are never going to find a variable that matters that's not mobilization. Emily Hafner Burton is not going to find a variable that does not concern something to concern with law or something like that. And so that became like problematic for me. And I was kind of like, not a connoisseur, or I'm not better than other folks, but I'm just like, I read widely and I respect my other colleagues. And so I was attentive to these other variables. And so on the question of what stops large scale state repression, I was kind of like, we don't really know. I mean, we've been doing this research for quite some time. I very much view myself as one continuing what Quincy Wright in international relations attempt to do, or Pittsburgh Sorokin attempting to do with regards to social movements. And so I very much view myself as that tradition, which is like more or less the 1930s, but the direct follower for Charles Tilley and Ted Gurr's kind of initial kind of creation of this subfield. And so limitations in the work focused on variation and reduction in state repression, not termination, not stopping it. We've just been exploring variation. I'm like, I mean, I literally mean we, right? I'm like, coming out in the early 1980s, not 1990s, I'm not that old, we were basically very much interested in variation. That's what we studied. That's how we operationalize stuff. And so we didn't get to like stopping. The idea of stopping it was really something that you get from the Civil War literature, the interstate war literature, which talked about spells. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Interestingly, the independent variables generally break down to be either domestic or international. And this becomes problematic from the sense of what I mentioned before about being attentive to proper specification and so forth, but it's also very disingenuous in many respects, as there might be some relationships between them that get missed. And theoretically, it's important, I think, to identify the fact that the theory that's predominantly used, which I'll go into a discussion of in a second, there's a presumed easy shift in repression. And so basically, I'm going to argue that the literature has more or less been engaged in a 50-year quest for the right cost that would then provoke a shift. And so in line with thinking of how people, including myself, have worked out the theory, it's generally a straightforward decision calculus in many ways, where you have particular benefits, particular costs, And if the costs exceed the benefits, then you're going to basically see a cessation or decrease in activity. What's important is after the calculus, the decision is made and repression is implemented. And another presumption, which I'm going to argue is crucial and wrong, is that the process is constantly updated. The parts of the calculus that aren't here are considering alternatives or the probability of success of the different activities, parts of the decision calculus that are hardly ever actually highlighted in any detailed way. And so I identified this idea of a repressive Leviathan. I was like, and this is merely an acknowledgement, right? So I tend to read a bunch about this stuff. And when you read about large scale state repression, it's a huge number of actors and actions that are involved in these campaigns across a wide variety of settings that are allocated across space and across time. And so when you take that in, it becomes really hard to think about things outside of that context. So like many people interested in social science and reading broadly, I loved the cover for the Leviathan from Hobbes. And then when you take that in, it's kind of like the physical embodiment of all these individuals, and then you start adding in actions. You're just kind of like, wow, okay, what comprises the state is this immense being. And so as I thought about thinking about the repressive process, I'm just like, okay, you have economic political elite. They come up with the idea. It's like, okay, we probably need to do something that involves coercion. They engage in this decision calculus. They allocate it to politicians who embody it and then distribute that particular action. The national police involve the state police, involve the local police, military they get the paramilitary involved, intelligence community. And so the idea for me was like, you have all these actors involved, and the arrows towards the end of the bottom of the figure, those are the repressive actions that are directed against particular targets and victims. Some are groups and some are individuals. And so you could think about it this way. But this way of conceptualizing the problem was transformative for me in many respects for thinking about what things were taking place and why. But then if you go from considering that statically to thinking about that model, that conceptual model being enacted out behaviorally over time and space, you're just like, okay, wow. All right, once these things are underway, it's got to be hard to stop. It's got to be hard to kind of get people to just no longer engage in these activities. And so you could think of this as lock-in. I like commitment escalation better as a concept. And that, in many respects, for me, militates against the traditional way of thinking about the decision calculus, because a particular decision calculus might have been made at a particular time and period. And that might have involved some evaluation of evidence, and that might have involved some consideration of alternatives and so forth. But after that decision is made, as it goes forward, you're not updating constantly. You're not drawing upon all information available. You're actually reflecting well upon the people that were present at that moment. You think about those networks, and you think about those relationships, and you become committed to that decision. You reflect back on it. That becomes a moment of identification. Where were you when this decision was made? How are you evaluated by those people? And so we don't see this complete openness to new information and evaluation that the existing literature suggests, but rather you become locked in and committed to that decision. And so if that's the case, then we conclude that the change or leading to stopping requires dramatic shocks to this process. And then the research agenda then became, okay, what dramatically perturbs this process? So I'm gonna argue democratization serves as a major disruption to the large scale repressive process. And this puts me at odds with people like David Beetham and some other maximalists who kind of like, well, repression is one of those things that helps define democracy. I'm not one of those people. And very clearly, I kind of, democracy for me refers to a particular form of institutional arrangement where some constituency group of citizens selects another group of individuals, representatives, to make decisions concerning the general direction of the relevant political unit. Now, that's very bottom up in many respects, or maybe lateral, but it has very little to do with what the government actually then engages in. And that distinction, I think, is extremely important. Now, so termination repressive spells is expected because democratization brings in a new group of individuals with a new connections to constituents and a new basis for political legitimacy. In fact, one of the smart moves would be for differentiating yourself from the previous regime is be like, okay, we're not going to do what they did. We have an opportunity to engage in something different, or we have an opportunity to actually distinguish ourselves in some way, shape, or form. So that could be protecting the citizens, or it could just be not doing what they did. And so differentiating those two will be kind of elided by this particular project, but I think that the correlational stuff I'll talk about with guarding democratization and the end of the spell hints at these, and these are the things, these are the nuances I'm now trying to kind of like ferret out with new work. So in order to engage in this investigation, first I need to create spells, right? We don't really have, there's no spell data. And so we needed to create some spells. And so we look at sequence of years where repression is above a particular threshold. We use the political terror scale. Spells start when they're equal to or above a 3, and they terminate when they're back below a 3. This gives us 239 spells and 132 terminations. For those that aren't familiar with the PTS, five scales or five levels. The threshold for this spell is 3. And this is because at a 3, I think we begin to approach those things that I was talking about in the beginning. In above a 3, there's a high intensity, high scope, violence, and political reasoning. And so from that perspective, I become very much interested in thinking about it. The spells, so the PTS here is just shown in the gray. The spells are shown in the mauve. I don't even know what color that is. It was red when I created it, but it turned into this thing. So we see Rwanda has a relatively longish spell. Spain, different kind of short-ish spells. Syria is basically in a spell for the full time period. So we do have some of those. The data is currently being updated, but I'll talk about that later. My sense of democratization, fairly straightforward. Chebob et al. Much more kind of election oriented. And the manifestation of the different, or the operationalizations for the other variables are very much in line with trying to identify what is the absolute best measure that has been used for capturing each one of these pieces. And we feel that we've done that fairly well. While controlling for GDP per capita, level of democracy, youth bulge, independent judiciary, civil war, as well as civil resistance. So parametric Cox proportional Has estimator, exponentiated coefficients. This is not very interesting, but all available. I'll actually give the paper to Dan. We have a piece coming out in JPR that kind of encapsulates part of the argument. And the book is with Oxford, and they're just incredibly slow, but we got the go ahead. So we're pleased about that. And so that'll enable you to kind of like go to some of the details. I'm going to give somewhat of an unorthodox piece in the sense that I'm giving my punchline away like, 10 minutes into the piece, because there's a bunch of things I want to talk about beyond this, which I think are useful for conversation. So democratization does terminate spells, and interestingly, no international variables affect spell termination. In fact, economic sanctions make things worse. This shows the kind of survival function, the differential for democratization versus no democratization. If you democratize, you're much quicker to reduce the spell in terms of time relative to not doing so. Subsidiary findings, I think, so this is one of those projects where like basically all of the findings that were being produced were interesting in the sense of, one, we knew nothing about repressive spells before this, and two, a bunch of intuitions about how we thought things functioned actually turn out not to be the case when you think about things this way. Civil conflict, population and youth bulges, prolonged spells, not surprising. Civil war termination, independent judiciary, shortened spells, also not surprising. I think this is fairly consistent. Democracy, economic development, and civil resistance are statistically insignificant. Somewhat surprising, especially for the last one. So civil resistance, and this is like, this is, it's funny, right? I have a class on social movement efficacy. We're reading This Is an Uprising, which is about how nonviolence is so important for the 21st century. So civil resistance is all they talk about. And then, of course, Maria Stepan and Erica Chenoweth's work is kind of what lead us there as well. Okay, we find civil resistance has no effect directly on spells. There is an indirect effect in that civil resistance leading to democratization, in turn, has effective termination of spells. So consider this the kind of like early kind of like pregnant cause. Pause for a second. Because now is kind of like, for me, is like where some of the interesting stuff happens. Endogeneity is provided in the paper. I'll send that. But I want to move to talk about some other stuff. And part of it is a perturbance of the general way that people have thought about things. And so we, as I mentioned, we've basically been exploring kind of repressive variation. That's problematic if we believe that there's a repressive life cycle or death cycle. I'm so caught on the label. I don't want to go negative, but it's just like, okay, we commonly talk about life cycles, but it's really a death cycle. But if there's an onset, escalation, magnitude, de-escalation, termination, recurrence, and duration, all as separate manifestations or aspects of repressive behavior, how are you going to talk about repressive variation when it's going to be very different according to which phase that we're in? So the literature presumes that something like economic sanctions or military intervention or naming and shaming are equally capable of bringing about a reduction in repression, regardless of what part of the life cycle you're in. So we don't think that's at all the case. And so I'll just talk about onset right now, but in the book we talk about the ability of these different independent variables to affect spell termination at each phase. So it's like, okay, are the same variables relevant for onset that are relevant for escalation, that are relevant for magnitude? The answer is no. Just for onset, no internationally oriented variables have any effect whatsoever. Regime durability, independent judiciary, and level of democracy, but not democratization, decrease the likelihood of onset, and onset likelihood is increased by civil war, youth bulges, GDP, and population. This becomes interesting. Can I do this? Can I do this quickly? So let me switch. Do you see a comprehensive view of important variable? Okay. Just like I'm like, yeah, what are you seeing? And so just quickly at a glance, this is onset, termination, and recurrence models, but this show you that democratization, not that finding was off. Democratization was not found to impact onset at a statistically significant level, but at a certain level of statistical significance. It affected termination, and it decreased the likelihood of recurrence. Democracy has no effect on any of those aspects. NAVCO had no effect on any of those aspects. Rule of law diminishes the likelihood of onset, increases the likelihood of termination, decreases recurrence. And so the variation is useful. But what's intriguing for me is, one, we've never seen a table like this within this particular area. But as a kind of scholar of political conflict and violence, you're used to seeing such variation of impacts across civil war spells or interstate war spells. And so one of the innovations was to get us here. And I think this table in and of itself is worthy of discussion as trying to think of if it fits in line with what we think different policies should be geared towards. Does it fit with what different people think about as they're trying to kind of study this object? And I think that is more than fair as a research agenda, but I will get to that in a second. Let me go back to where I was. What? Okay, my bad. Okay, Prezi limitation. I will accept all criticisms there as I zip through where we've been in order to get to where we're going. I love that figure, by the way. The whole human interaction component of the presentation is hindered significantly as my wit is not well carried over in this venue. But
start laughing audibly, if that would help. Just give you a little encouragement.
Thank you very much. That's why you're such a fabulous friend and colleague, Dan. That's good. Almost caught up. Sorry, I thought that intervention would work. Yes, very good.
I like having the overview. Actually, this is kind of nice. Coming right through it again. That wasn't a bad thing at all.
Thank you. So then there's a question. So from that finding, you start to question different things, which is useful. But before I get to this interaction comment, one of the reasons that Ben and I ended up doing this together was to kind of address the bifurcation in the literature I was mentioning earlier. I generally believe that repression is driven by domestic forces. Ben generally believes that repression is driven by international forces. And so we were each kind of like representing our areas, and we were just like, hey, it's an empirical question. Let's see what works out. But we were also kind of like, that division of labor helped us tremendously as we were thinking through exactly what was working. So then with me turning out to be right, okay, and Ben not, we were just kind of like, whoa. It's like, okay, so is there an interaction effect? Does it matter how long a spell has been going on? So maybe international factors matter more in longer spells. No, international variables are not significant regardless of short or long spells. Interestingly enough, democratization has a stronger impact for longer spells, which we thought was incredibly interesting. Okay, well, so maybe what is this kind of a coalition argument about the individuals that are around that repressive spell? And so I'll hint at this in a second. We need to kind of really break that up. Who's the coalition that forms around a repressive spell? But it's really this issue of, well, maybe you don't need to change the whole system. Maybe you can just change the leader. Okay, no, removal of the leader does not have an influence. Maybe it's coup or revolution. It's different forms of change. No, irregular transfers of power do not influence spell termination. Okay, maybe there's something about the Che-Baba-all measure. We shouldn't consider that. Okay, Vreeland's X-polity measure reveals similar effects to the Che-Baba-all measure. We're now going through a variety of different VDEM ones. I don't know if any VDEM people are on this call, but I'm just like, I'm still not yet convinced yet that that I should take your measure as being valid. So is everything really about civil war, the kind of civil warification of political conflict and violence? No, the influence of democratization does not appear to be conditional on what happens within civil war. Implications. Don't think I'm done, because there's a bunch of next steps that I think are extremely interesting, but I'll just talk about this for a second. So I think part of the perturbance here is the need to focus on repressive spells explicitly has been made. It's like we need to step away from this nation year format. It's not conducive to properly understanding or studying the particular phenomena. We also need to unpack democratization to identify the specific actors and actions versus across the communities at for and against the policies. We need to find out who these people are, what the coalitions and networks are, and then look at this idea. And this gets back to this model, which really messed me up when I started to think about it. I'm just like, okay, so we need to understand not only the policy creation, but the different people that were associated with the policy creation and who were against it, and then track that over time, which is not incredibly easy to do in the large and cross-national context, but we're trying to do this with cases. Policymakers, advocates, and advocates, we need to stop discussing and implementing the host of things that have been shown not to work, which is really hard to do because amnesty is all about naming and shaming. It's what they do. There's legal and trade agreements organizations. There's people who advocate nothing other than military intervention or economic sanctions. And so revisiting this whole conversation is incredibly useful. But in so doing, we also get to the discussions of prevention and democratization. And the democratization debate really didn't go that well in the 90s, right? There's a whole, like, what does democracy do? And there was a small set of people that were kind of, democracy can do this, or democratization can do that. The democratization to repression discussion, I think, was highly underdeveloped. And so if we think of the things that democratization can do, this should be listed as one of the things that it can do, and thus it should be placed in the conversation. And it nuances the civil resistance debate a little bit as well, but I think that's much needed. So I have 3 steps that we're engaging in. Some I'm doing myself and some that I'm doing with Ben. Validating the spell list, we've looked at against every other data source that's been collected, and we're looking through historical monographs and expert surveys now, making those comparisons. Part of my my VDEM concern is, so the information is taken from experts, but the experts are receiving information from particular sources. So if we're dealing with like the World Handbook or UCDP or Fear on a Latent Civil War measure, we have some sense of the material that they're using to make the determinations that they're doing. We don't know the material that individuals are drawing upon, but we do know from other types of efforts that some of these source materials are hindered because of the violence itself. And so I'm hesitant to just run with the kind of like expert codings without kind of that kind of cross-validation. We're developing detailed case explorations of all spells. This is underway. We have a bunch in the book, and that's because, like with any econometric model, right, we're forced to make some assumptions. And we explore some lags and some leagues, but that doesn't necessarily reveal all that we find in the sequence. So Albania is pretty decent, right? So we have NAVCO, nonviolent direct action in 1990, that overlaps with the democratization effort. And 6 to 8 years later, we have spell termination. Some of the cases don't look as neat, but they generally kind of play it out. Bolivia seems fairly straightforward. 78 NAVCO, some democratization, some more nonviolent direct action, some more democratization. Takes a little bit of time for spell termination, but that back and forth isn't exactly kind of representative of the very simplistic kind of like theory that we had. South Korea, some long delays in between some stuff. You have some nonviolent direct action, then you have some democratization, and then you have some spell termination. So some complexity, some nuances with regards to timing. Some cases don't look at all like that. Like Nicaragua, we don't have nonviolent direct action. We have violent action and civil unrest in a variety of different forms, leading to some form of democratization. The violence continues, and we don't have spell termination for quite some time afterwards. So does that generally fit with a confirmatory case? It's like, no, I don't think so. But ours is a probabilistic model, right? So we don't expect all to fit. We then also looked at, there's a presumption within our initial conception that all spells look alike, which isn't true. Some stay at 3, some stay at 4, some stay at level 5, some move. And so we've looked at all different combinations. Our findings are robust across those specifications. Part 2 is kind of like, this is kind of where we're going, right? It's like, Ben didn't want to punt on the international ones. And frankly, I didn't think it was fair to do so either. Ours offered a particular version of an evaluation, but it was like, okay, well, maybe there's interaction between these two sets of factors that yields the outcome that we're interested in. Maybe there's certain types of sequences. Maybe there's certain things that happen first that facilitate these domestic effects that we're expecting later on. And so we're exploring those. What are the effects across the repression life cycle, right? So are the different variables influencing repression differently in some kind of DNA sequence? Is there a DNA sequence that leads to spell termination? And so a different modeling approach, but that's kind of like where we're going. And the idea of cohort differentiation is the thing that I'm like really trying to struggle with. I need to know who was in the room when the decisions were being made. What were their positions relative to the particular policy? How central were they to this particular organization or this implementation to the top of the pyramid? And so in a sense, it's kind of like, it's partly selectorate, but it's also partly some other concepts, right? So trying to piece together these coalitions is very difficult, especially when governments aren't always clear about who was in the room when these decisions were being made. The top one, the first one on part 3, this is like, I just got denied for some EU grant, some ERC thing. Hopefully no one on this call was there because I'm just going to talk horribly about you. I think they were just completely wrong. I'm just like, one of the reasons why repression might end is because governments are finished with doing what they set out to do. This, of course, presumes that we know what the state project was, which we're not always clear on. So I've been developing data on state projects to get a general sense of what were states trying to accomplish when they were engaging in the repressive behavior. In order to do this, you actually need to develop information on perpetrator target specific dyads, which I've tried to get at with Yuri Zukov and Nadia Kostiak with regards to the cross sub data that we collected. There's more data to be compiled, so we need to get there. We have 195 countries already from 68 to 2019 from 22 event data sources. We're adding the United States and India right now. Also, this led me to get to more specific kind of repressor target data by spell year. I think I'm up to like maybe 18,000 dyadic spell years now. This kind of, so we have a bunch of perpetrators and specific targets that the repression is directed against. And then from that information, I'm then zeroing in on, okay, what was the perpetrator trying to do? What differentiates this particular figure from what you might be familiar with is I have guerrillas as listed as perpetrators, and that's because of how the coding was undertaken. If guerrillas have territorial control over an area and they act basically as the state acts, then they can count as a human rights violator. And so this variation is extremely, I think, interesting in many respects. This just shows the number of reported cases. And for me, this became fascinating because the police are the most frequent actor as a human rights violator, directed mostly against dissidents and criminals, but also a large amount towards civilians. And so for me, post-Floyd, everything that's been taking place in terms of the conversation and this American focus reveals that this is an international problem, which needs to be addressed. That said, while the police are quite active, unstated agents, guerrillas are the most violent, which are interesting in and of itself. The military is also quite violent, but some categories see very little violence at all. I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Christian. That was great. We've got almost an hour for Q&A. We've got a few questions that have already come in, but please feel free to put your question into the Q&A, and I will do my best to get to them. I wanted to take the first shot though, if I could, and it relates a little bit to that third point you made about why repression might stop, because the state is finished, right? So, but I want to put in a little more of a broader, like maybe meta-theoretical way, if you will. So the theory you have is very cognitive, okay? So in a sense, and you're correct in a cognitive approach, but with also, you're still kind of thinking in those terms, I think. So the idea being that, okay, they're not updating all the time, but there's some kind of shock, which makes them think differently, right? Makes the state think differently about costs and benefits, right? And in the extreme, you could even think that could be like a theory of like economic policy change. You know what I mean? Like, why do states change their economic policies? Well, there's a shock, there's a crisis, cost benefits change, so they change policy, right? But violence is different, right? You know better than anybody, right? Violence is different. Violence has a physicality to it, which is not strictly, can't be reduced to the cognitive, right? So I was sort of thinking about as you were talking, I was thinking about the North Wallace and Weingast argument about how political order comes about. And essentially their argument is, well, you have conflict and then there's like a ceasefire. There's an armistice essentially. And then that's when you get these open access orders and these good things, because there's some kind of, they run out of gas or something. It's completely underspecified in their argument, but just they fight and then they stop, right? And you get political order and democracy and all these good things when they just stop. They don't really tell us why. So I'm sorry, this is a big question, right? But it seems to me that, like, given the physicality of conflict, that, I mean, termination can mean, for one thing, it can be the termination of the targets, right? It's certainly one possibility. That could be one reason. So it's not a termination of a strategy, but also a certain kind of, again, to go the North Wallace Weingast perspective, a kind of exhaustion, like on either side, that simply the physicality, the physical toll of conflict becomes such that termination becomes, so it's different than a cognitive, I mean, I guess you could fold it into costs, I suppose, but could be just something about, you know, time, the toll, the, you know, that it takes, which means we would need a different, or a theory that takes the violence part of it seriously, such that I couldn't say, I'm going to take Apple Davenport and apply it to economic policy, because it's the same kind of idea. Yeah. Does that make sense? But anyway, so if you have any reaction to that, I know this is kind of the new frontier where you're thinking about it, but how do we make this more that this is actually about violence as opposed to just a state strategy like any other?
That's fascinating. I mean, so the exhaustion point is really intriguing. I've kind of occupied this space through Randall Collins's work, Violence, and Grossman on Killing. I'm kind of acknowledging it's like, okay, it's like most people have an aversion to engaging in the violence, right? So it's like, okay, exhaustion is very different, but, you know, just an aversion to doing that. So then people need to come up with resolutions to how to overcome that aversion to violence. Collins takes us there by, it's like, okay, you know what? We have these sociopaths and they love to engage in violence, so they never get tired. We need to distribute them across the security forces. That's one way that people do it, but also mechanization might be another way to try to overcome it. But I think that's all very useful. And using exhaustion as cost is fascinating. And in line of support of your argument, fives don't last that long. Fours and threes last a lot of time, but fives are basically kind of like large scale violent activity. Everyone's being targeted, and like those spells aren't generally as long. You can have long ones, but they're not as long as fours and threes. And so I think that lends credibility to it, which is useful. And I guess I'm kind of going in, I think all the targets are eliminated. Those are extreme cases. Those probably don't happen that much, but there's an element of, we killed enough to kind of communicate the message. And so that's kind of how I got into, this state project thing, because I was trying to figure out exactly, we're not really clear on, the literature is mostly, I argued this 50-year search for costs, because we're not really good on the benefits of repression. I'm like, are you kidding me? I'm like, because we only say, it's like, well, leaders do it to stay in office. And I'm like, what if you own everything else? So the office isn't worth the headache, and it's better to kind of pretend to kind of like shift to something else. But this actually led to, and it might be a Weingast piece, I can't remember now. There's a piece in the review where they talked about kind of like that like you needed like some opinion convergence in order to have the creation of some institutions and their stability. And they don't talk about how you got to opinion a convergence. And I'm like, violence helps get you there. So I'm just like, what if you could like coercively purge the population to eliminate extremes, facilitate a certain cohesion around a certain core group, and then you build institutions in that space. And so I think this is how I view kind of like, this is the next generation stuff. This is the more deeper kind of like dive into kind of understanding the causes and consequences of the activity. But I hadn't thought of exhaustion as cost, but the minute you say it, it makes so much sense. And we have not taken the violence seriously, or we're trying to avoid it, in part because it's a darker story. It's nice to know. It's like, oh no, naming and shaming and law gets Bashir to see the light. And I'm like, he ain't seeing no light. I'm like, Kagami's not going to see some light. I mean, that's not going to work. They need to go, and everyone associated with them need to go. And that's a very different take. But it takes, I think, the violence and what's involved to engage in the violence incredibly seriously from that. But I think, Erica de Bruin's work, there's a couple of pieces that come out now that actually get us to the particularities of security force construction, which we were horrible with historically. It's like, oh, the state just has access to people, and then they can engage in violence. It's just like, what people? What are the relationships? What are the chains of command? How they relate to one another? And so I think we're much better with that now. But I think you've definitely put out a point. But I'd love to. So I'm going to love to test the run out of gas versus we killed enough differential, which is just like, I think that's kind of what it needs to be considered, which brings us back to state terrorism, right? Which is like, the label's not used, but that's where we started with this terrorism business. And the state terrorism suggests, I mean, this is kind of my pushback against like Foucault and Rajali, which is kind of like, rather than hide your persecution, why don't you persecute, this is what I think about African Americans, like, you take a group, you persecute the hell out of them, revealing what the state can do, and you show that to everybody else. You'd be like, okay, you're just like, no, it's not hidden. It's quite obvious. And it's for, I mean, they're only 13.4% of the population. And of that 13.4 population, I'm sure the poor Blacks are receiving the most of it. So, 8% of the population is basically being shown what the state can do to influence everybody else. That's pretty efficient. And so I think those conversations are now getting started. Sorry, long answer.
Great. I mean, and this whole idea that the comment that, like, repression is costly, it's like, I mean, let's take the benefits really seriously. I mean, in a lot of cases, I think repression makes everything else cheaper.
Exactly.
As soon as you intimidate people, you either eliminate the extremists, or you just basically signal either, it's plato o plomo, as they say, right? That either, I mean, if you don't, so in any event, so think about the benefits from the state's perspective. And exhaustion could be on both sides. Exhaustion could be a state thing, but it could also be on the social movement side. So let me try to open it up to we've got some great questions coming in from our colleagues. I will go first to go with Pauline Jones. From our department, who asked two questions that I'll sort of combine. So she asked, how does democratization occur in the context of large-scale repression? And she followed up by asking, could you say more about the spells? How are they conceptualized, measured, and validated?
I'll send you the paper on the measure validation thing, because that's really not that interesting. Some people have a problem with PTS. They're just like, aren't we over this PTS thing? I'm just like, no. But what we've done is, what I like about the PTS is it combines scope, purpose, so amount of the targeted population, the political logic of it, and the degree of violence, and they bring them all together, which I think is very helpful. And they gave us something to globally compare against, which has been useful. The pushback has been the subnational movement to kind of like, well, this data is measured better. So I compare the spells against all the subnational data that we collected in cross-sub, and for some cases that we didn't have in cross-sub yet. And these time periods are more or less validated, which for me was very useful. What's interesting though, historically, the Civil War and the interstate war literatures start with lists. They start with, okay, what are the wars? Okay, and then looking for correlates. Okay, Civil War started with lists. The repression literature never started with lists. We jumped immediately into repression is ubiquitous and it varies. And so we never got to this list thing of high spells. And then the questions that people come up with in the human rights literature about the problems with the human rights data don't apply to spells. They don't apply to more ubiquitous forms of repressive behavior. Okay, so then recording of this or that might be missed. When it's exceeding a three, those are more or less the ones that everyone can agree upon, and we rarely talk about those things. And so that kind of addresses the measurement thing a little bit. The democratization occurring in large scale repressive spells bit is interesting. There's a presumption that if you have repression, the state is so damn effective about eliminating everything that you couldn't possibly have any changes. But this is missing the kind of dissent repression nexus literature that shows that the outcome of repression could be going underground, going into more rebellious activity, or it eliminates the challenge. And so there's something to be said about our presumptions about how effective repression is. And the democratization literature, which is fascinating, because I would have thought that we would have had a heck of a lot more evaluations of, okay, exactly what are the contexts within which democratization takes place. We know incredibly little about the circumstances under which democratization takes place, but repression is not one of those things that basically has that effect. And that's, Jay Olfolder had some work, but also some other people that kind of revealed that. So I thought that was very fascinating. But it's this presumption. This is kind of part of my beef with Beetham, right? He's just like, oh, if you have repression, it's not really democracy anyway. I'm like, seriously? Okay, so I'm like, so the United States is not a democracy until 65? Really? I'm like, is that what you're saying? You believe that? But then it's like, how does the shooting of a labor leader or the disappearance of a labor leader influence the willingness of people to vote? It's like, wow, big presumptions, right? It's like, okay, guess what? Hoffa disappeared and labor was incredibly, well, they were led in a particular direction, but the participation rate was pretty high. So it's like, so what these connections are between these different manifestations, the different aspects of democracy and repression aren't as clear as I think we generally tend to think about. And frankly, the myth of the all-seeing, all-effective repressive state, where'd that come from? Who's advocating that? It's just like, probably the state, right? So it's just like, I think there's this whole element about, I mean, when you look at what Otpor did with the Milosevic regime, is fascinating. It's just like they Monty Python him, right? And it's like, could Milosevic have taken them all out? Was he engaging in different types of repressive activities? Yes, but they like chipped away creatively at stuff and then kind of like moved forward. Now, it's a different comment. So my skeptical side is what led me to my other steps, right? So it's like, okay, so you stopped the repression. Does that mean that the underlying problems of the authoritarian regime that prompted people to be dissatisfied in the first place has been handled? And I'm like, no. And this is where I differ with Maria and Erica. I'm just like, okay, so you got a new leader, and they look better because they're no longer shooting many people in the street. They just found a different way to manipulate you and control the narrative. And so it's just like repression might be costly in that way, in the sense that we don't know with any degree of certainty what the outcome of that repression might be, and it could lead to more problems for you. So if you can move away from the coercive and lead with the material and the normative, then you have a higher likelihood of maintaining control and less likelihood of pissing some people off. And so I think those connections need to get made, but that's definitely a good point.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised the question of effectiveness, because I mean, one thing that really struck me from reading one of your earlier books when I taught it this fall was, I mean, one of the strongest findings is that you say that, prior repressive behavior increases subsequent repressive activity, right? Which says something about effectiveness, one would think, right?
Yeah.
That to some degree, say it doesn't seem necessarily to quote unquote work if you have to keep doing it, which could be a function of the fact maybe weaker states are the ones that do it in the first place, because they can't govern in other ways. So you get these short spells, or maybe even, lower just outright repression when they're efficient at it. And so that, I think that question of efficiency has got to come in, as well in thinking about these things.
What was interesting for me is like, I mean, the 13-year gap between that book and now, right? I'm just like, I had, when I finally realized it, that's kind of like what pushed me in some of the spell direction. I'm just like, okay, one of the most powerful and consistently statistically significant variables in all repression models that use it would be lag repression. But we, as a literature, we never theorized what the lag meant. We never theorized I'm like, damn, that means spells. Now, what's interesting is, despite being the most powerful variable, not every piece uses it. And that's because if you start introducing the lags, then you need to kind of take some other kind of problems to bear. And many people weren't doing that. And it's just like, this is like my beef with the literature. I'm just like, look, either the variable is there and you need to incorporate it and address it regardless of what it does to your theory, or you start messing with specifications which aren't valid. And so once you take it to heart, though, you're just like, okay, what does this lag thing mean? Oh, wow, okay, it means spells, damn it. And so then you start to go there. So it's very useful to kind of like go there.
Yeah, I mean, we know why there's a coup trap, right? But we don't actually know why there's a repression trap, or what, it's like they're at least you could run at least 5 different stories through that, right? And it probably works out differently, but it's really, thing about the time is really interesting. Okay, terrific. All right, we got more questions rolling in. Charlotte Cavalier from the Ford School, and our colleague as well, has asked, so if repression is a process with different stages, isn't it the same for democracy and democratization? And so can the latter, meaning democratization, could that also be introduced as a separate variable in the model?
So break up the democratization process?
Yeah, and it looked like when I was looking at your, like, the South Korea, it looked like you did seem to have some sense.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
So
no, that would be interesting. Of course, I would need a better developed democratization literature to help me identify what those stages would be. But presumably, if they can be broken up into time periods, which they haven't yet, that would be useful. But then it would also be intriguing, right? If we could identify who the actors were that were involved in democratization, like political parties or courts, and try to figure out exactly how you piece those back together to see if there is some kind of sequence. So I found interesting. So there's a bunch of judicial independence people, right? And it's like judicial independence is what drives everything. That's the most important aspect of democracy, democratization. But it's judicial independence that is normally on the back end of a series of other changes that usually constitute somebody calling something a democracy or a higher level one. And so that became interesting. So unpacking that and getting to the sequence, I think, is incredibly useful. Perhaps this reveals my more my interest of repression than with the democratization bit. I tended to follow some of the innovations I delve into the judicial independence literature to find out generally what is done there and why they do it. I don't really believe in law or that it has an impact, though. So so I'll step back from that. I'll be enough of an empiricist to be like, okay, you tell me what it is I should pay attention to and why. I'll consider that. But I like this democratization process bit. But that definitely will militate against the technique that we applied. One of the reasons for mapping them out the way that I did temporally was to identify if there was some recurrent patterns, right? So I'm now playing with some kind of like DNA sequencing programs that allow me to kind of see singular and concatenated changes in sequences over time to get me to this spell termination thing. But then I find that's just a different way of doing political history, right? And so I have no problem doing that, and did some early stuff where I was trying to map them out, and it was just like, I'm like, wow, what does that mean? Because how many pathways are there to spell termination is basically the thing. And although I put my hands up, I'm actually excited about that thing, not kind of like, oh, it's more like a, yeah, I'm like, so I'm very much interested to kind of unpack that. But I'm like, first I need to try to perturb a bunch of people who are just running models to kind of like explain variation and don't understand spells. And so I'm like, I've been spending the last few years trying to convince people that we should be studying spells and not the way that we're looking at stuff now, which is just incredibly frustrating. But that is where things are.
Okay, terrific. Okay, next, very happy to have a question from an outsider, but someone who will soon be a colleague. We have a couple questions from Luciana Chamorro, who is an anthropologist from Columbia University, now at Arizona on a postdoc, but she's coming to WCED in the fall for a couple of years. She works on authoritarianism, kind of an ethnographic perspective in Nicaragua, so she's going to be great to have on board. So she has a couple questions. So she says, thanks for the presentation. And she asks, is the type of conflict relevant in this model of spell termination? So for instance, ethnic conflict versus persecution based on political identification. And she's also wondering whether there's any correlation between the path towards spell termination and the chances of a new spell emerging. Any thoughts on those?
I've tended to step away from conflict type and been focusing more on I guess the configurations of type as you have it, like ethnic or political. And I've been more kind of caught with the behavioral, right? Which like violent, non-violent, large scale, small scale. And so so the nuance you suggest I've not explored yet. I have a different project called The Consequences of Contention, where basically I'm developing a new measure for contention, arguing that so you have protest, policing, insurgency, counterinsurgency, riot, anti-riot, revolution, counter-revolution, terrorism, counter-terrorism. I'm just like, okay, all these hint at the fact that we have state and challenger behavior and that we should be considering them jointly. And so I've been developing those measures. And so I've been less about the type than developing this new thing. But I like your idea of pathways, right? Because what I started doing was, so some people are interested. So for me, civil war would be here, genocide is here, where government very little challenger, and revolution where you have kind of like challenger, very little state. And so I'm very much interested in where and how you move through this space, and thinking about kind of like how the pathway leads to kind of like subsequent things. This is kind of where the idea of the state project comes from, because I'm just like, okay, so if your objective, if the project was the decimation of this particular group, you don't achieve it completely, but you achieve part of it. Okay, does that mean you're going to come back for another round to kind of finish folks off? Well, maybe that depends upon if you've been able to kind of institutionalize or co-opt in between, so forth. And so I think it leads to some interesting questions. But I'm very much a if you're a Tilly fan, like I am, his one of his last kind of democracy books, it's these trajectories of kind of like democratic development, and those I found to be fascinating, because I'm just like, I'm like, wow, what does that mean? What's going on with that? What implications does it have for other types of policies and activities and things within society? And you could relate it to kind of like changes in political opportunity structures, a bunch of different ways that you could think about those different oscillations. But I find myself, I'm very much a trajectories person now, right? I'm just like some of my work. I tried to have this kind of evolutionary theory of state repression with Rose McDermott, and we just got so much pushback from it that publicly I stopped like trying to get it published. But it has animated much of my thinking about this, and a lot of that is kind of like some selection, some isomorphic transformation, and then kind of some similarities that you start seeing with regards to how people structure things and behave. And so I'm definitely taken by that idea. Well, and look forward to having you come.
Yeah, WCED is a safe space for trajectories, my man, because we are always we love people talking about trajectories of all kinds. So this is great. Okay, so so my colleague Adam Casey at WCED, he's a research fellow and also going to be a postdoc for the next few years, and he's going to put your feet to the fire here a little bit on the theory. And this is, I think, question that almost anytime you get a quantitative data, this is kind of the quality case question that you're going to get, right? So he asks, what is a real world case in which democratization came about for reasons at least mostly unrelated to the termination of violence and repression, and then independently decreased state violence? And why was it democracy that led to this decline? What is the mechanism? So this, kind of speaks to the endogeneity, which you kind of prompts in the paper, but I think it's worth addressing verbally. Like,
yeah, I'm like, I think just because I can show you some instrumental variables that fits the criteria and works, then that doesn't necessarily get you there. I think that my response to you is going to be very much kind of Hannah Arendt oriented, which is not necessarily where you'd expect me to go. Repression is the weapon of the weak, right? And so I think quite frequently, if a state is engaging in it, they're looking for an opportunity. How can we stop doing this? How can we get out of this? And I think Dan's characterization is right. There's a repression trap of sorts. I think democratization provides an opportunity for a group of individuals that could engage in repression to not do it by taking the opportunity to use some other strategy. Give me an instance where violence is not involved. I could refer you to the ones that we have in the paper, right? So the Bolivia one looks like it clearly kind of identifies the dynamic. I'm trying to think of one that would be reasonable to talk about. Yeah, I'll give you one where there is no perturbance, and there was some democratization, which would seem to be kind of showing my coalition argument to be a little bit more important. So most would view Mandela's election is being connected with an instance of democratization. I'll argue, though, that human rights violations for those that document such behavior don't see much of a change pre-post, and that's because Mandela basically relies upon a lot of the people that were involved with the government before. He doesn't perturb the security apparatus, and thus we see a continuation of behavior. But then the conception of democratization is somewhat questionable as a function of this disruption of the coalition. And so Mugabe steps in, his right-hand man steps in. It's like, so we need the perturbance of this coalition bit. But it's also an alternative, it's an opportunity to engage in an alternative form of social political control, basically, that doesn't involve coercion. And so I think these opportunities are provided by these changes. So does the state have the capability to still engage in repressive behavior? Yes. Did the potential lack of ability to kind of like kill things off serve as a willingness to consider or entertain other options for social political control? That might, I think, be useful as well. Yeah, so I'm not sure if that gets you there, but.
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking about this question theoretically, right? So like what would be a threat to the argument? Like what kind of evidence, right? So clearly like reduction of violence and democratization in a kind of a Tillian way, right? These are like mechanisms, these are trajectories which get wrapped up in each other, right? In a lot of cases, right? So what would lead us basically to the conclusion like, well, no, and I think maybe we move away from Adam's question to sort of ask about costs and benefits per se. So what's a case in which you could say it's not just so decline benefits of rising costs of repression give you both democratization and reduced repression, right? Something like that. Which doesn't strike me as necessarily a problem, but one thing maybe worth thinking about is how would democratization compare with other kinds of political changes? Because one possibility, so think about Osamolegwu and Robinson for a minute, right? So they basically say, well, if an authoritarian regime says they're going to redistribute, it's not credible. So what democratization gives you is a credible commitment to actually redistribute in the future. Because basically, if you respond
although they don't generally, right? We get from the grand level, it was like they don't. Yeah.
But if we follow the logic, right? So, how might we think about what democratization is? So one way to think about it is it's a whole set of changes that go together, right? And so the idea could be something like with democratization, you actually get a whole set of reforms that go together that you actually need to make the repressive spell end. Whereas, so for instance, so things like, I don't know, things like a new federal arrangement, right? Allow territorial splitting, allowing competitive elections, but without other kind of reforms that go along with it. Like you could show that there's other kinds of political changes that, but falling short of democratization, don't end the spell. It might be a way of showing what's the actual value added and what's the specific.
I mean, that's kind of why we went there with regards to the looking at coups and revolution and leadership changes. That's kind of that's pushing on it. I think I'm forgetting. It might have been Charlotte. No, Shamoro. I think it's we do have this issue of I like the idea of trying to figure out. So the democratization we measure is largely connected with elections, but if you break up the different parts of a democratic process and try to figure out exactly what combinations exist, right? So, okay, so judicial independence, okay, so election, multiple party representatives, try to figure out exactly which combinations are associated with these moments, I think would be useful. I think the set of changes thing is interesting, right? It's just like, so, and this is where my Achilles of the domestic democratic peace pitch comes in. It's like, okay, so Biden's coming in. I think most people would view this as a kind of like resounding moment where democracy has become more fuller in terms of its democraticness because of who's coming in. But I think he's also set up to have a mandate of repressive campaign against white nationalists with complete support of everybody else or most people. And so the domestic threat is countering these other kind of processes, which I think is kind of interesting. So yeah, I'm just like, I think I don't think what's interesting is like I'm like Adam, what would that variable be? I'm less amenable to this. Oh, these things generally kind of they go together with one another. It's part of the democratic agenda. Yes, repression is generally ramped down. So that there's some other variable out there. So give that one to me. I'm just like, I'll take it for a minute, but then I'll just be like, most of my pushback on endogeneity issues are just like a lack of theorization. I'm just like, okay, give me what this thing should be. What's that underlying thing? Since my general pushback to much of the repression literature is, I think it's all about economic inequality. And as long as that's maintained, then none of these institutional forms are going to have much of an effect. Democracies have an opportunity to step away from repression, but they're going to use repression to protect the economic inequality. And basically, we haven't just like gone there with regards to look at. And so I'm involved in a deeper dive and trying to kind of explore exactly how perpetuation, creation, and widening nature of economic inequality is related to repressive behavior. And some of this is related to this purging of the marketplace, my de-marketplace of ideas thing, Charles Limbaugh related, is kind of like, okay, so now that we've eliminated, or now that states have eliminated most of the theoretical and political ideologies that challenge monopoly capitalism in many respects, or at least gut it in terms of its effectiveness, then you could relax your repressive behavior. And that is going to be a global phenomenon. So we're going to start seeing similarities with regards to repressive behavior because this thing has been eliminated. So I think there's an element of economic inequality and protection of it that lies beneath many of these processes. I don't see the you shouldn't. If you're hearing that I believe that democratization is dramatically transforming the security apparatus and the willingness of the states to engage in coercion, no, I'm saying this offers an opportunity to step away from this policy that has some spin-offs and some backlash effects that are a little bit problematic in many respects, acknowledging that it's not really that effective in many respects. It is an episode of kind of like desperation of sorts. Until this is more like Dahlman and Breslauer, right? And until normative and material power get to a certain level where they can basically kick in and eliminate, or you've eliminated enough of those that have these belief systems that are dangerous. And so I don't think democratization is kind of like, oh, we've now repackaged a whole mechanism of social political order. It's just a reason for stopping one particular form of domination and utilizing some others, but not eliminating the necessity for it.
It's a disruption. It's a disruption.
Yeah. So a lot less of a definitive kind of like termination in many ways.
Great. Okay, I want to get a couple of questions in from our graduate students, graduate fellows at WCED. First one from Cem Emrens. And he's going to get back to this effectiveness question a little bit from the state's perspective. So he says repression can take several forms. So which forms do work and which forms do not work from the state's perspective? This could be related to target selection, intensity of violence. What do you think? The conception of effect. This is my Why Social Movements Die book, man. So it's like so individuals, institutions, ideas. Your level of effectiveness can vary. Violent behavior, and then which community. So violence tends to. This is some work with Chris Sullivan. Violence directed against social movement organizations, not populations, just writ large, but against social movement organizations tends to make the hardcore harder and to turn away those that aren't that essentially connected with the activities or mission of the group. And so is it effective? It's effective in a way, but it's also problematic. So it depends which level of analysis you want to use. So part of the difficulty is like, governments aren't quite sure, right? Nonviolent behavior from governments tends to, in an Axelrod-like sense, lead to kind of nonviolent behavior of challengers. But the Communist Party of the United States was engaged in like largely nonviolent behavior, but their ideas were incredibly threatening. So the state still had to go after them with some violence and get rid of some activities. And so I think the repressive form and what is effective, unfortunately, what is effective in many respects is genocide, but no one really wants to talk about that. Eliminating large sections of a particular group is highly effective if that group is not necessary for some form of development later on. I think the effectiveness question needs to be paired with a broader concern with consequences. So when the consequences of contention piece, most of the literature on like outcomes of violence and consequences is Civil War related. And so it's like, how does civil war affect the GDP per capita or something like that? We bring all forms of violence together. And so I get back to your answer with the following. We find that it's state violence relative to challenger violence
State violence is the one that has a broader negative effect on politics and economics. And for a variety of different reasons as it relates to kind of like citizen attachment to or perceptions of what government should be doing relative to what challengers should be doing. But government violence tends to generally be negative in terms of its consequences. And we rarely consider that. Most of the consequences that people consider are the ones that you were kind of pointing towards, like how does it affect behavioral challenges? But there's other aspects of what repressive governance does that has negative after effects for kind of like what could take place within a society.
Yeah, and I think another real challenge to answering the effectiveness question is like these policies aren't in a vacuum, right?
Mm.
So states are doing other things while they're also doing repression. So if you can think about a case like Indonesia, which 1965, 66, new regime comes in with insanely high levels of violence, mass violence, but they also follow it up with pretty substantial developmental goods. A lot of spending, a lot of new policies, rice self-sufficiency, a lot of things in the countryside. So very difficult to know. There's obviously benefit of the quantitative approach is try to be able to say, get out of the single cases where a lot of things are going on.
Mm.
But those cases do suggest, right, that unless there's a way to model that quantitatively, then unless we can get a good sense of, well, how much is it, what is followed by, and, but as you say, sadly, like graveyards are peaceful, right? This is gonna be something where sometimes the high scale of these things is exactly what leads to termination in its worst sense. And that's, as analysts of these things, politically, you can't kind of shy away from that.
Yeah.
Let's see, so another question from another of our graduate fellows, from Enrique Pedraza-Kopkipke. So he's asking about the police. So I know this is a question you'll be interested in. So you pointed out that police forces are often the protagonists of these spells of violence. So does that vary according to the intensity of repression? And how could democratization have an impact on police violence specifically? So democratization, police violence.
Yeah. So although police are the most ubiquitous, they're not consistently the most violent. Generally, when the military or guerrillas get involved, the degree of violence is significantly ramped up. And so I'm working on a book that's based on this dyadic stuff, because although I was led to this dyadic analysis from the work with Ben, when I started to do it, I was like, I had a different orientation, but I also wasn't sure what was going to be revealed from looking at the dyads. And so when I saw them, I was kind of like, oh, what does that mean? But what I find, the argument that I'm trying to build regarding the dyadic, explaining the dyadic spells, because then when I had the data dyad, by the dyad, I then create dyadic spells, right? So police citizen, police dissident, and how long do they go? And part of my argument is, so there's a literature that suggests that it's the isolation of the perpetrators from the civilization, from the rest of the society, that increases the likelihood they're willing to engage in violence. And it's the degree to which you could easily dehumanize the perpetrator. And so I argue that the two of these come together. And so if you have isolated security forces and marginalizable targets, then those are the worst case scenarios. So the good thing about the police is that they're largely less isolated than the military and like paramilitary units. And so one way to kind of get to them, but they're still kind of subject to some of these negative characterizations of the challenger, like in the criminal context, is like, how criminals should be treated is not always, it's not always great. And so, but then this degree of isolation relates to your democratization kind of point. It's like, okay, so to what degree do we expect there to be a connection between political leaders that have been placed in power through some process, bottom up, involving the citizenry and multiple kind of like points of accountability and so forth, gets back to this isolation bit. So I would think that democratization would matter more for people that are whose activities are more subject to like public scrutiny, like the police. And it would be less valuable for situations when the military is involved as the perpetrator, because they're less isolated. They're more isolated from the society. And so I would expect this democratization bit to have more of an impact on police-related dyads than non-police related dyads, for example.
Okay, terrific. Well, you've been working hard. You taught this morning. We've been asking a lot of you. So I think when we
This
try,
is exciting. This is
try, try,
exciting.
try to wrap this up. Well, I mean, I think just bringing these democratization conversations into tandem with these questions about violence and repression, there hasn't been enough of it. And you just see the more it's one of these topics where the more you talk about it, new questions arise, and new connections and new possibilities. And so I think, we hope you're gonna, it's great to have you in the fold. We want to have you around as much as possible and be part of these conversations. Try to keep these kind of talks going. Great way to kick off the semester. So thank you again for the time. I know it's a busy day for you. It's a busy Tuesday. So great to have you here. Let me just.
This is acceptable, man. This is acceptable. Other stuff less so, but this is great.
That's true. Yeah, you're going to be asked to do a lot of things you'd want to do less than this. So
yes.
This is at the end of more like things you actually want to do. I really hope that's true. But yes, get a little bit of break is also something hopefully you want to do. So let me just wrap up with, again, just a notice on what's to come. Again, thanks everybody for showing up during lunch hour. So the next two events we've got coming up, WCED. So February 23rd, we're going to have Fiona Shenbai, who's our former postdoc here, coming back. At least virtually, to give her talk on courts and repression in Africa, undue process, persecution and punishment in autocratic courts. And then March 9th, we're gonna have a big roundtable, reviving democracy globally and locally. Michael McFall, Hari Han will be talking with me about both at the global level and the local level. Is there anything that ties those levels of analysis together, what have you? But for now, this has been great. Thanks to Derek Groom very much at WCD for setting this up, making it run so seamlessly. Christian, thanks for taking time in a busy day. Let's keep talking, both you and I and everybody else who was here today. We had a good turnout, and I'm sure everybody got a lot out of it. So thanks again very, very much.
Okay? Definitely. Thanks, everybody.
Everybody stay safe in the snow and in the pandemic. All right, take care.
Seriously.